Howdy and welcome to Chapter 2, Analyzing Needs and Identifying Instructional Goals. This chapter starts the first steps in the systematic design model we discussed in Chapter 1. After studying about this phase of the process, you'll be able to define the problem for your learning project and develop your instructional goals. So I thought this was a great quote that started off this chapter, that solutions to problems are like keys and locks. They don't work if they don't fit. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense in instructional design. Solutions to problems, in particular training solutions, need to effectively address the real problem at hand. I mean, solutions could look good and be fabulous programs, but if they don't address the main problem, they're useless. Companies that don't use a systematic process find themselves in this exact situation. I've seen this especially in software solutions, where a company will buy a great software package because it just looks really great and impressive, and then they find themselves forced to answer the problem instead of the other way around. So think about it. For example, what if an organization is experiencing severe tardiness? People coming in late, and supervisors aren't following the company procedures and disciplining these people to get the absenteeism rate lowered. So someone might first look at this and say, oh gee, we need to train these supervisors. They don't understand what the policy is. But if an instructional designer comes in and analyzes that situation, they may discover, for instance, that a train is coming every morning and parking next to the manufacturing plant to unload supplies for that day, and does this between 6 and 7 a.m., and it blocks the employees being able to get to the facility. So the supervisors realize that, and they don't write the employees up because they feel it's not their fault. So this isn't a case of training supervisors in policy. This is more of an external issue involving logistics and changing that particular procedure that occurs. So you can see why this is such an important component of the whole instructional design process. So how do we determine whether an instructional design is a good fit with a problem? We have to say, what is the problem? We have to know the problem. If the problem is a human performance one, is instruction the best solution? The example I just gave, no, it wasn't, but let's say it was, and the supervisors do need to be trained on the policy. Then we would ask ourselves, if the solution is instruction, is systematic instructional design the best way to provide it? And then, assuming it is, then what are the instructional goals? And these are the things we're going to be doing in this chapter, and you'll be doing for your learning project as well. So first thing we need to do is a needs assessment. We need to distinguish problems, situations, or projects that are appropriate for instructional solutions, such as job-specific training. Okay, so what we have to do, we have to determine the gap. We have to look at what's happening right now, and then the criterion, or what is the ideal situation? What is it that we want ideally to be happening? And we look at the difference, that's the gap. Okay, and then we have to determine, what's causing this gap? Why does this exist? What are the effects of the problem? So we have to collect information about the condition. We have to ask people. We have to identify the criterion and the ideal state. So a lot of analysis occurs at this point, but it's important that we figure this out. So we have to identify the real problem. Okay, and we have to say what's causing the situation. Okay, we need to make sure that we're not just looking at symptoms of a problem, because symptoms of a problem don't really tell us what's causing the problem. For instance, we may look at a situation and say that tasks are not being performed up to standard. Employee performance is getting worse over time. Deadlines aren't being met. There's a work backlog. Some tasks are being forgotten. Okay, these aren't the problem. These are symptoms of what's going on. So we need to further investigate to get to the root cause. What's causing all these symptoms? So one mistake a lot of designers make is they kind of stop at the symptom phase of it and say, okay, these are the things that are happening. But you have to be careful not to state the symptoms of the problem only, but to go further. I mean, dig deep in. What's causing this to occur? So we can ask all kinds of questions. What's the problem? How many people are affected? When did the problem become evident? What are the consequences? What's happening now? How do we know there's a problem? Who's affected? Are some locations affected more than others? What should be happening? So we want to go in and ask questions in order to dig down to that root cause. We need to determine the relative importance of the problem. Not every problem is worth solving through instructional design. We have to make sure, is this problem worthy of going through this process? Because as we discussed last week, it can be a long, expensive, resource-intensive process. So we want to look at it. We want to know, why is this discrepancy important? What's going to happen if we don't do anything? Will something bad happen? How much is the discrepancy causing the organization lost time in things like production, wasted materials, lost time, employee turnover, and so on? What's the benefit of correcting the problem? So you need to kind of determine that, the scope of what's going on. Okay, once we do that, we know what our problem is. Now we need to start setting goals. And before we do objectives, which we're going to do in the next couple weeks following this week, we have to consider the larger educational goal that leads us to the objectives. So the first task is to identify the problem, then state the need in terms of the desired performance. That was part of the gap analysis. Then these performance standards are what becomes the instructional goals. Okay, the goal is that ideal. What is it you want, ideally? That becomes your instructional goal. So you need to state the goals in terms of an action the students will do after they demonstrate, what they've learned. Okay, it has to be action-based. Goals have to contain a verb that identifies an observable action. Okay, we can't use words like students will understand this, students will know this, or appreciate. They have to be action verbs. So the book has some great examples. So refer to Table 2.1 for examples of learned abilities stated as external performance. Also, refer to Bloom's and Gagne's taxonomies for examples of verbs. There's some great things there. And when you write yours, you need to go back and you need to do this. And it's not an easy thing to do. It takes some time and some thought to really get this right. But it's important because this is what everything else is going to flow from for the entire semester. So we have to get this right now. Okay, so instructional goals need to be measurable. They need to describe the behavior the student has to perform in observable terms. They have to indicate what the student can reasonably accomplish. They can't be too hard or lofty, otherwise it won't make sense. They have to specify the context in which the learner is going to make the behavior functional. Okay, so then we have to set performance criteria. So the final step is to include a criterion that will indicate that the goal has been successfully achieved. And at this point, we're talking about a group goal, not an individual goal. So in educational situations, usually these goals are set up by outside agencies. If we're talking about a school system, for instance, think of standardized testing requires students. 90% of the students will have a 70% or more on the math proficiency, something like that. Okay, but oftentimes in corporate instructional design, we need to set our own goals. So refer to Table 2.5 for some examples. There are some great examples there of criteria that could be used. So when developing instructional programs, we have to designate these goals. Once the goals are selected, you'll see in the following weeks, we're going to develop one or more objectives to assess how we're doing, what the progress is to that goal. So the goal and the objectives are used to assess progress, though they'll have the same behavioral outcome. However, objectives are going to become the basis for assessing student performance, the individual, on the goals. Okay, and we'll have more of that in the next couple weeks, but it's important to get this part of it down pretty well. Those are the high points of Chapter 2 and what we're going to be doing. Chapter 2 is an important chapter in that we're defining problems and we're identifying our instructional goals. So I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.